Well, this is Adjunct Professor Moran, Macroeconomics. Last session we discussed gross domestic product, the business cycle. Tonight we're going to discuss the second major macroeconomic variable, unemployment. Unemployment is measured by the unemployment rate. You take the number of unemployed workers and divide it by the labor force, multiply it by 100. The labor force is not the population of the United States. There are approximately 340 million people in the United States, and only about 200 million are in the labor force. So, maybe like 1/3 of the population of the United States is not in the labor force. In order to be counted as part of the labor force, you have to be willing and able to work. And these four categories of people are considered not willing or able, so there's no value in including them in the labor force. For example, children under 16 years old are not considered able. They haven't been trained, they're physically unfit, for example. Institutionalized people, like prisoners or people in mental hospitals, they may be willing to work, but they're not able because they're behind bars or incapacitated. Voluntarily not looking for work. This is an important category considered discouraged workers. So we'll discuss that in a minute, but if you continually look for work and are denied because there's not enough jobs, you may then withdraw from the labor force and just give up out of despair, in which case you are no longer counted as part of the labor force, even though you're able. Once you stop looking, you're not considered willing. Homemakers, students, and retirees are not counted as part of the labor force. Homemakers are not producing anything of monetary value, so they are not counted. Students, you're the exception. If you work and you are a student, you're counted as both employed and part of the labor force. But if you're a student only, you're not counted as part of the labor force, and so you have no impact in that way. Retirees have voluntarily withdrawn from the labor force, so although they may be able, they are not willing, and so are not counted as part of the labor force. The unemployment rate is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and there are some criticisms of it. One is it counts part-time work the equivalent of a full-time worker. So you may be desperate for a job and be compelled to take a part-time job, even though you prefer full-time work. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics is not going to split hairs about who's a part-timer and who's a full-timer, and so they will each be counted the same. And if you really want to know, the government does calculate that separately. They have statistics on this. Similarly for a discouraged worker, a worker who gives up looking for work drops out of the labor force. So again, to be counted as unemployed, you have to be actively looking for work. You have to be willing and able. And if you remember pictures of the Great Depression, the people living in Hoovervilles or the shanty towns, they're homeless people because they lost their job and they continually looked for work but couldn't find it. And eventually they gave up looking since the unemployment rate was so high. And that's called a discouraged worker. So for example, the official unemployment rate in the Great Depression was 25%. But if you count the people who gave up because there was no work, even though they were still able, they were considered not willing, the unemployment rate was actually 33%. 8% of the population was unemployed, but were counted as discouraged workers, and so excluded from the official unemployment rate of 25%. Everyone who's unemployed can be placed in one of three categories: frictional, structural, and cyclical. Two of these are considered natural, and the government will not seek to reduce them. One, though, the government has accepted responsibility for eliminating. Frictional unemployment is a normal part of the economy. This is either people between jobs or people who are looking for their first job. Economists want you to leave your job if you don't like it, for example, or if you get fired. And that's because if you're not happy at your job or not effective at it, we aren't doing the best we can to satisfy our wants. So you should seek another job for which you are better suited. Another type of unemployment that is natural is called structural unemployment. A structural change that's happened in the economy concerning either consumer demand, technology, or geography. And so these people have guessed wrong about what kind of work to go in or where to locate their job. And so they're going to be unemployed. And this is normal also. For example, a change in consumer demand will cause structural unemployment. How strange would it be if the government insisted you get around by horse and buggy when the blacksmiths became unemployed because they were being replaced by car mechanics when people preferred to buy cars instead of horses? Technology. So when I worked for business, there were many junior accountants, but because of increased automation, for example, when you buy a meal at McDonald's, that's doing the work of a lot of accountants, a lot of junior accountants. in addition to making change. And a lot of those junior accountants then would be fired. And that is heartless, but on the other hand, those people are now freed up to do other kinds of work because their work is being done in a more efficient way. Geography. The South is sometimes called the Sun Belt, and many companies in the North are relocating to the South. And that, if you would become unemployed for that reason, you would be considered structurally unemployed. When you consider how many cars are now being made overseas and imported into the United States, you could say that is a change in either the geography for structural unemployment or a change in consumer demand for structural unemployment. Workers in Detroit, for example, have suffered higher levels of unemployment as their jobs have been replaced to either other places in the United States or overseas. Now that's normal. These two, frictional and structural, are normal, and it generally adds up to something called the natural rate of unemployment, which is not 100%. This should account for about 4% of the population. Now, any unemployment rate higher than 4 or 5% of the population is considered cyclical unemployment, and cyclical unemployment happens because of changes in the business cycle. An uptick in a downturn in GDP will cause an uptick in unemployment, and this results from a recession. And the government has now accepted responsibility for trying to drive this to zero, as a result, leaving only frictional and structural unemployment. So, for example, if the unemployment rate currently is 7.9%, and the government wants unemployment to be, say, 4%, then we have 3.9% cyclical unemployment. Full employment is not 100% of the labor force. Frictional and structural are natural events in the economy, so people are always in jobs today are natural events. So frictional and structural are natural events in the economy, so the government will not try to reduce it to zero. Full employment in the economy today, also known as the natural rate of unemployment. So it sounds like an oxymoron to say the full employment unemployment rate, so I prefer the term natural rate of unemployment, or NRU. Was considered between 4 and 5%. It may actually be as little as 3.5%. It seems to have changed because of fundamental changes in our society. The greater number of younger workers, the higher the natural rate of unemployment is going to be, the more frictional and structural unemployment will occur because younger workers don't have as many skills as older workers, for example. But the number of younger workers has been declining, and so the natural rate of unemployment seems to be falling. Temp agencies help people find work more quickly than in the old days. I had to actually buy a newspaper, look for want ads, send a resume with a cover letter away, wait for that to be returned, and then possibly get an interview. So electronic means of getting work is reducing the natural rate of unemployment. Doubling the prison population removes highly unemployable people, and as a result causes the natural rate of unemployment to be smaller. Welfare reform in the 90s caused the natural rate of unemployment to fall. So the natural rate of unemployment changes over time because of societal reasons. Why do we study unemployment? Because there are costs to unemployment. Unemployment equals unproduced output. In other words, we're not satisfying as many wants as we otherwise could if we had employed all of our resources. There's something called a GDP gap between actual GDP and something considered potential GDP. So let's take a GDP graph over time. So we'll put GDP here and time here. And let's say this is our economy, and this is actual GDP growth. But let's say this is what represents full employment, and we are now experiencing unemployment in this area. This vertical distance is the difference between potential unemployment, which happens when GDP is at full employment, and GDP sub-actual when we have unemployment. Right. It would be very good to know how much did we lose in output that could have been used to satisfy wants had we instead been at potential unemployment. So full employment is when there's about 4% unemployment. So that would be around 96% of the labor force having to work. So only an economist can say that when you have 4% unemployment, you're still at full employment. To measure the loss of output, an economist named Okun developed a law that estimates loss of output caused by higher unemployment than the natural rate. And his idea that helps us estimate this is called Okun's law. Okun's law indicates that for every, you take the actual rate of unemployment and subtract out the natural rate of unemployment. So today, the actual unemployment rate is 7.9%. The natural rate of unemployment at full employment, is approximately 4%. That gives us an excess of unemployment over the natural rate of 3.9%. Okun says for every single point, this is over the natural rate, there is a 2% fall off in output. Take the excess of unemployment, multiply it by 2%, and you'll get the percentage of GDP lost because of excess unemployment. And if we take that number and multiply it, so I'm going to open up an Excel file here. Okay, so we've got 7.9% minus 4% gives us an excess of unemployment of 3%. Multiply that by 2%, and we've lost 7.8% of GDP. GDP is lower than it should be by 7.8%. For every single point, the actual rate of unemployment is over the natural rate, we lose 2% of output. Now, let's find out what that is in dollars. So currently, GDP is approximately $19.5 trillion. Take $19.5 trillion and multiply that by the lost output of 7.8%. And we've lost $1.5 trillion in output, which is a lot of Twinkies. All right, now unemployment is not shared equally among all members of society. So, for example, the lower level of occupation, the more likely you are to be unemployed. The higher your occupational level, the less likely you are to be unemployed. Younger people are more likely to experience higher levels of unemployment than older workers. Blacks are more likely to have a higher unemployment rate than whites. Genders are similar. Men and women have generally very similar unemployment rates. The lower your educational level, the higher your unemployment rate. The higher your educational level, the lower your unemployment rate. And the unemployment rate itself, how long on average people are unemployed, will vary depending on economic conditions. So the length of time people are on average unemployed increases during a recession and decreases during periods of economic growth. This concludes our discussion of unemployment, the second major variable of macroeconomics. And there'll be a handout that we're going to complete in connection with this. And our next topic will be inflation, changes in the price level.